My name is James Wilkins, and I'm the author of Survivor. Many years ago I had an experience that I feel like that God allowed me to have in order to help minister to and help the dear women who are suffering so unbelievably because of the aborting of their baby. The title of this story, I'm a Murderer and a Monster. This story took place in 1961. It's a true story. At that time I was working in a Skid Row mission in Los Angeles. We preached to over 25,000 men that year. And during that time we had this man named George. And although this title says that I'm a murderer and a monster, it could not really reveal to you the tension and the potentially dangerous situation at the end of this story. As we were at the Skid Row, many times I took my children who were 7 and 6 and 4, and they'd sing, and the men down there, their hearts were touched because they were away from their family and children, grandchildren. They were actually derelicts living on the street. And so it was during this time that I noticed George after they sang. And he was a huge man, looked like a professional wrestler. In fact, he had been a ranger in World War II, and he was as strong as he looked. The men at the mission stayed away from him because he had a horrible temper. He seemed more like a man that was possessed. There was something that was just eating at him that was actually killing him. And so I noticed George kind of holding back tears during my children's song, and so I met him at the door when he was leaving, and it was there that I talked to him. And I always made it very clear that about the 4 spiritual principles. And I didn't have to stress the fact of sin very much because these men were on Skid Row because of their sinful, wayward lives. And I'd cover the first spiritual principle, and as I was covering the second, that the wages of sin is death or separation from God, George seemed to go berserk. He began to tremble. He could not stand still. He began to shout, more like bellowing. He said it several times before I jeopardized my safety. He said, "I'm a murderer and a monster, and God cannot forgive me." And I said, "George, calm down." And he just kept on raging. I shouted, "George," and I took him by the arm, and I pinched his arm, and I said, "Calm down, George, shut up and listen to this message of hope." And he calmed down. And I, through tears, just told him that Jesus loves you. And again, George started trembling, pacing again. He said, "No one could love me. I'm a monster and a murderer, I told you." I interrupted him by quoting John 3:16. "God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish." And then I read or quoted, "But God demonstrated or commended his love toward us in that we as yet sinners, that Christ died for us," which seemed to settle him down a little. I told him of God's love, and I did so. He began to shake his head in a violent way. He said, "No, no, no, nobody could love me." I prayed for him, and George went out into the dangerous dark street in that part of Skid Row. On the following Monday night, he was back, and I talked with him some more. And this happened several times, and George had always said, "No, no, no, nobody could love me. I'm a murderer and a monster. I deserve to be punished." And so our church that I was pastor of at the time was miles from downtown Los Angeles. And I would go by my study at the church oftentimes after I taught in a Bible college just to study or to do administrative duties. And on this particular day, I came to the church door and it was unlocked. I was puzzled. And I went inside and I noticed that the office door to my office was open. I went in and I was shocked to see George standing there. And he says, "You've got to do something. You've got to do something. I'm on my way. If you can't help me today, I'm on my way to send myself to hell where I belong." And I said, "Sit down, George." And he wouldn't do it, but I commanded him and insisted, knowing that I had to stay in command. And he kept saying, "I'm a murderer and a monster." "George, what have you done?" I asked. "It's too hard to tell," he answered. "It may help to get it out, George. Get it off your chest." The following story he began to unfold as George would cry and almost mourn as he nervously paced around my office. George had been a ranger in the Army, and during D-Day his outfit was parachuted behind enemy lines, and they were told to, the orders, explicit orders, is to kill anyone, friend or foe, that detects you. This whole campaign depends that you do what you're sent there to do. And he said, "Oh, I can still hear George say, why was he out there? Why was he out there? What in the world was he doing out there before dawn?" And he said, "A little French boy." He said he came and he said, "Americanos," and smiling. And so I took my hands and I put around his head and snapped his neck, and I could still feel how it felt when I killed him, when I broke his neck there, and the smile on his face faded into a look of terror. And he said, I broke his neck, and he stopped his story and stood there weeping for a couple of minutes. And then he said, I can still see that smile. I can still feel the snapped neck, and I broke it. I started to say something, but George said, "I have a beautiful wife. Although I have a beautiful wife and a dear mother and a son I never saw, I've never gone back home after World War II. I'm a murdering monster, and I just couldn't face them." I started drinking, and when the Korean War started, I realized I re-enlisted, hoping I'd go to Korea and be killed, what I deserve. I must be punished. Again, I started to say something, but George shouted, "That's not all. That's not the worst part of it."